Hello everybody. Uh, this is going to be the first of hopefully many video deck techs on dual commander deck lists. This one is going to be about mono red, uh, and in this case it's going to be an aggressively slanted beatdown deck with copious amounts of burn. The first thing we're going to talk about is the commander, obviously. It's the flagship of the deck, and in this case it's Zurgo Bellstriker. For a single red, you get a 2/2 that can't block creatures with power 2 or greater, and for 1 and a red, you can pay its dash cost. And it says that you can cast a spell for its dash cost. If you do, it gains haste, and it's returned from the battlefield to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So that's pretty advantageous because generally you're going to be playing Zurgo on turn 1. There are very few corner cases where sometimes you don't want to, but almost always Zurgo on turn 1. And then if it's killed off later on in the game, you can cast it for its dash cost to get in some hasted up damage, which is very nice to have a card in the command zone that's very good on turn 1 and passable later on in the game. There aren't a lot like that in terms of aggressive commanders. It's worth noting that if you are casting Zurgo for his dash cost later on in the game, after he's died a couple of times, the commander tax of 2 additional mana per time that Zurgo was previously casted does apply to the dash ability. So keep that in mind. And there's a definite deck building slant because Zurgo is the commander. We're only playing one converted mana cost creature in the deck, and that's because you don't need to play anything but the best in terms of the 1 mana cost creatures, and that's because you're going to be playing Zurgo on turn 1 almost every time. Next, we'll move on to the creatures. The first being Abbot of Carol Keep. It's a 2 mana cost 2/1 with prowess, so whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it's going to get +1/+1 until end of turn. And when Abbot of Carol Keep enters the battlefield, you exile the top card of your library until end of turn. You may play that card. So there are not a lot of built-in card advantage mechanisms in aggressive red decks. So Abbot of Carol Keep is a very, very welcome sight in the deck. Uh, you don't really want to be playing a lot of otherwise high converted mana cost cards that would gain you card advantage because they would slow down your game plan. Being mono red, there's not like cheap efficient card draw that will become card advantage, and it's sometimes hard to stay at card parity with your opponent because they're going to have access to a lot more tools than you are by virtue of being a single color. So any of the reasonable costed cards that are going to gain you card advantage are going to be very good in the deck. So that's why Abbot of Carol Keep is here. Next, we'll talk about Ash Zealot, which is the first of a long line of 2 converted mana cost creatures that also have haste and are 2/2s. This happens to be the best statted one because it also has first strike along with haste, and it has a nice clause that says whenever a player casts a spell from the graveyard, Ash Zealot deals 3 damage to that player. The only one in this deck is Firebolt, which has flashback. So it's generally not going to be affecting you, but it is worth noting that it's very good against opposing cards with flashback, Snapcaster Mage, Jace's Ren Prodigy, things like that. So keep that in mind with Ash Zealot. Next is Ball Lightning, which, as it's named, many other cards are nicknamed after it. They're Ball Lightning style cards. This is for red, a trample haste 6/1 that you sacrifice at the beginning of the next instep. So I wasn't a huge fan of these cards uh, in the 30 life version of Duel Commander, but with 20 dealing, in this case, roughly a third of your opponent's life total with a single card is too good to pass up. So Ball Lightning is very good in this deck. Next we have Blistering Firecats, which is very similar. For an additional colorless mana, you get an additional point of power. Otherwise, it is the same. And it also has Morph, which you can cast it face down as a 2/2 for 3 mana. And for red, you can flip it face up. Generally, you're not going to be morphing Blistering Firecat, but sometimes if you are stuck on 3 lands or you want to conceal it or whatever, you can morph it, and that is occasionally relevant. Next is Chandra's Phoenix, which for 1 red is a flying haste 2/2. So in general, flying is very good in the format, and that's why this card is being played. But also the ability to recur the Phoenix after it has died is very nice. And the recursion clauses: whenever an opponent is dealt damage by a red instant or sorcery spell you control, or by a red planeswalker you control, return Chandra's Phoenix from your graveyard to your hand. So in general, we're not going to be triggering the planeswalker part of that, but there's plenty of burn to be able to get back Chandra's Phoenix. And don't forget about it if it's in your graveyard. Next we have Eidolon of the Great Revel. A lot of lists play the just enchantment version of this card, which is Pyrostatic Pillar. And for those of you who don't know, they both say when a player casts a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less. In this case, Eidolon deals 2 damage to that player, but for Pyrostatic Pillar, it says Pyrostatic Pillar deals damage to that player. So in this case, for red and a 2/2, you get what was previously a card stapled onto a 2/2 body for basically free. And I really like Eidolon of the Great Revel, but I'm not a super huge fan of Pyrostatic Pillar. And I'll tell you why. First and foremost, it's not a creature, so it's just worse than Eidolon in most cases. It's better in some where they have a lot of removal spells and they can kill Eidolon. But generally, uh, whenever I was playing, I would have Pyrostatic Pillar in my hand, and I wouldn't want to cast it on turn 2. I'd rather play a creature on turn 2 so that it can get through and deal damage. Then at that point, I'm basically forced to decide whether I want to resolve that or another spell every single turn for the rest of the game. And the longer you wait on Pyrostatic Pillar, in general, the worse it gets. So I decided to cut it from the deck because I just wasn't a huge fan of it. It is worth playing if you like the card though. Ember Hauler is a bear, which is a 2/2 for red, and for 1 mana you can sacrifice Ember Hauler and deal 2 damage to target creature or player. So that's very nice because you can play it on turn 2, have it get a couple of attacks through, and then once the ground is clogged up, you can use it to, remove an important creature or deal damage to your opponent to try to finish the game off. So just a very nice card to have that is good in the early game and is passable in the late game. Obviously, if you are casting it for 3 mana to deal 2, that's not exciting, but it still does something, which is more than you can say for a lot of the creatures that are just vanilla beats. They don't have haste or whatever. Flamelake Phoenix, which is for 1 red, you have a flying haste creature that must attack each turn if able. And with the ability Ferocious, which is if it's in your graveyard and you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you can pay a red and return Flamelake Phoenix from your graveyard to your hand. There are not a lot of cards in the deck that are going to be able to trigger Ferocious. There's Ball Lightning, there's Blistering Firecats, there's Hell's Thunder, there's Hero of Oxid Ridge, and There's the Mountain from Koth, and then there's just about any creature equipped with Bone Splitter or Grafted War Gear. So I give 7 ways. Realistically, a lot more if you're talking about these, but 7 physical cards that are going to allow you to enable that. So in general, it's just a 2/2 flying haste creature for 3, but that's still plenty good enough. Then we have the only 1 converted mana cost creature aside from Zurgo in the deck, and that's because you basically never want to play them over a Zurgo Bellstriker, so I figured I would just cut them because they're not super exciting to play whenever you are not playing them turn 1. Um, and adding more of this of 1 converted mana cost creatures to your deck, like for example Jackal Pup, Fire Drinker Satyr, cards you are basically forced to play if you're going to try to play this archetype in with a different commander. You're just not forced to. You only can play the best if you want, which I can think of 4 off the top of my head that are very good: Goblin Guide, Monastery Swiftspear, Grim Lavamancer, and Vexing Devil. I just dislike Vexing Devil a lot, and if I was going to play Grim Lavamancer, or if you do, I recommend playing as many of the red fetches as you own, ideally all 4, to help fuel the ability. It also helps with Searing Blaze, triggering landfall on your opponent's turn as well. But I'm only playing Goblin Guide, and the reason is it just kind of helps fill in the curve. With a lot of 2 converted mana cost cards in the deck, you're pretty often going to be playing turn 1 Zurgo, turn 2 2-drop, and then turn 3 2-drop, and then you're kind of wasting an extra mana. And sometimes Goblin Guide can help you spend your mana more efficiently. We have Goblin Heel Cutter, um, for 4 mana. Whenever it attacks, target creature can't block this turn, and it has dash for 2 into red, which is notably 1 cheaper than its actual converted mana cost. So you will 99% of the time be dashing this card. So try to keep that in mind. And it's just very useful for pushing past opponents who are trying to set up ground blockers. Worth noting for Eidolon of the Great Revel that dashing Goblin Heel Cutter, though you're spending 3 mana, does not trigger it because the converted mana cost is 4. But dashing Zurgo, for example, for 4 mana, if he's died once, will trigger it because the converted mana cost is in fact 1. There are a fair amount of 3 power creatures for 2 mana, and all of them are probably playable. I haven't really thought about a lot of them. There's the newest one, that's the 1/3 First Strike Menace that summons a 2/1 monkey when it attacks. That one will probably go in the deck, and the energy one that creates 2 energy when it comes into play, and then when it attacks you can pay 2 energy and give it a +1/+1 counter. Also probably should be in the deck, but they're currently not. One because one hasn't been released, and the other is because I just haven't thought about putting it in there. But both are technically probably better than Gorehouse Chainwalker because it's a 2/1 for 1 in a red that unleashes, which means it can't block if you're going to turn it into a 3/2, which generally isn't relevant. You're almost always going to be attacking, but it is worth bearing in mind. Then we have Hellrider, which is one of only a couple 4 converted mana cost creatures or cards in the deck, and it's because it's extremely powerful. It's probably the most powerful card in the deck in terms of how much it does. It's a 3/3 with haste that whenever a creature you control attacks, it deals 1 damage to the defending player. So it attacks for 4 by itself, just like Hero of Oxid Ridge, which is its most direct comparison. But unlike Hero of Oxid Ridge, the creatures aren't required to become unblocked for you to get the additional point of damage out of it. Also worth noting that you can redirect the damage from Hellrider to defending planeswalkers if that is relevant, so that you can split up your damage. If you attack with 4 guys, you can 4 creatures, you can kill a defending planeswalker with 4 loyalty, and then use the rest of your creatures to just deal damage to the player, if that's relevant. Hell's Thunder, which is for 3 mana, a 4/4 flying haste that you sacrifice at the end step, and it has Unearth for 4 in a red. So it's basically a burn spell with flashback. It just requires that you connect with the defending player. It's a very good card. I've been happy with it since I've added it to the deck. It's been very good. Hellspark Elemental, very similar. Uh, 2 mana, 3/1 trample haste that you sacrifice at the end step, and it has Unearth, which is, I guess I didn't mention, with Hell's Thunder, you pay the Unearth cost, you return it to play from the graveyard, and then if it would leave play, you exile it, so you can't just use it over and over. But these are essentially burn spells. We have Hero of Oxidridge, which is a 4/2 with haste and battle cry, which gives other attacking creatures you control +1/+0 when this creature attacks, and also when it attacks, creatures with power 1 or less can't block this turn. So just a bit more relevant text on it. That, I guess, the argument of Hellrider versus Hero of Oxidridge is like the bottom line of text versus not having to deal for your creatures to become unblocked to get the additional point of damage out of them, and I prefer Hellrider. Ire Shaman, which is very similar to Avid of Carol Keep. It has Morph, and then for a red, you can flip it face up. It has Megamorph, so it'll get a +1/+1 counter, become a 3/2 with Menace, and you exile the top card of your library, and you can play it until end of turn. So, same argument for Avid of Carol Keep right here. Both can be played on turn 2. Worse than if you got to play them and potentially get a card off of them, but still acceptable. Keldon Champion, haste, 3/2 with Echo for 2 and red. You have to pay its Echo cost, which is the converted mana cost at the beginning of your upkeep if it entered play, basically. If you cast it the next turn, you're going to have to pay its Echo cost. Or if it gets exiled and returned to play, you're going to have to pay its Echo cost again. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to target player. Essentially, it's 4 mana, 6 damage. I think this is the weakest of the 4 drops, but it still is passable because it deals a fair amount of damage. And then its little brother, Keldon Marauders, which is a 3/3 for 2. When it enters or leaves play, it deals 1 damage to target player. And it has Vanishing too, which is at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter from it, and when you remove the last time counter, you sacrifice it. So it's essentially 2 mana, 5 damage. So you're going to get 1 attack in, barring some weird proliferation stuff, and then you're going to sacrifice it. So 1 when it comes into play, 3 when it attacks, 1 when it leaves, 5 damage. Lightning Mauler, which is a 2 mana, 2/1 with Soul Bond, and it gives the Soul Bonded creature, the creature it's paired with, and it haste. Worth noting that the only creature above 2 converted mana cost that does not have haste is a morphed Ire Shaman. So it is almost always correct to just pair this with Zurgo Bellstriker and attack. Just get your 2 points in. Don't try to worry about hasting up another creature in the deck because there probably isn't going to be another one. Then we have Mardu Scout, which is a 3/1 for red with dash. So essentially, you get to dash it, deal 3 damage, it comes to your hand, and you get to do it again and again and again. It's essentially a 2 mana creature version of Lava Spike. It's just very good. Mudbrawler Cohort, which for 2 mana is a 1/1 with haste, and if you control another red creature, it gets +1/+1. So just another hasty 2/2. This Lightning Mauler, kind of Mardu Scout, Ash Zealot, and Speedway Fanatic and Valley Dasher are those versions of the cards. Then we have Scab Clan Berserker, which for 3 is a 2/2 with haste with Renown 1. So if it deals combat damage to a player and it's not renowned, it gains Renown and it gets a +1/+1 counter. And whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, if Scab Clan Berserker is renowned, it deals 2 damage to that player. So just very good card on turn 3. Slightly worse later on if the ground's getting gummed up, but it's still very powerful if you're getting it renowned. Speedway Fanatic, which for 2 mana is a 2/1 with haste, and whenever it crews a vehicle, that vehicle gains haste until end of turn. We don't have any vehicles in the deck. I'll probably pick up a Smuggler's Copter for the deck with its recent banning. And then I guess that technically that'll do something, but the haste part, but generally this is a 2/1 with haste for 2 mana. Stormblood Berserker, which is a 1/1 for 2 with Bloodthirst 2, so if an opponent was dealt damage this turn, it gets an additional 2 +1/+1 counters, and it has Menace, so it's a 3/3 that has to be blocked by 2 or more creatures. Valley Dasher, which is a 2/2 with haste for 2, and it must attack each turn if able. And then lastly, Warname Aspirant, which is a 2/1 for 2 that if a creature you control attack this turn, it gets an additional +1/+1 counter on it, making it a 3/2, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 1 or less. So just basically another 3/2. Next, we'll move on to the instance. We have Brimstone Volley, which is 3 mana, deal 3, and if a creature died this turn, it deals 5. So we have Ball Lightning, Blistering Firecats, Ember Hauler, um, Hell's Thunder, Hellspark Elemental, Keldon Champion, Keldon Marauders. Those are ways of your own creatures triggering Brimstone Volley, and obviously if your opponent uses a removal spell, then it's 3 mana 5 damage, which is exciting, rather than 3 mana 3 damage, which is not great. Burst Lightning is just a shock effect that later on in the game, if you have a lot of lands, you can kick it so that it deals 4. Chain of Plasma is a recent addition to the deck. When you first look at it, it looks like, why would I want to play this? It's 2 mana, 3 damage to target creature or player. That's great. It's an instant, also good. But then that player or that creature's controller may discard a card from his or her hand. If that player does, he or she may copy this spell and may choose a new target for that copy. So you're like, why would I want to do that? They just get to kill my creatures. But basically, if they're going to do that, you get to copy it again. And you're probably going to be discarding a card that otherwise would do nothing. And you're getting another free 3 damage probably to them. And then if they copy it again, you're going to do it again. So if they're copying it, it's just going to be very good for you. And if you get to a point where it's just going to finish them off, then it doesn't matter that all the text is irrelevant past 3 damage to target creature or player. Char, which is 4 damage to a creature or player and 2 damage to you, just efficient. Fire Blast, which is 6 mana, which is an insanely steep cost for 4 damage to a creature or player, but it has an alternate cost of sacking 2 mountains. So you don't want to do what I call defensive fire blasting, where you have to use it to kill a creature or defend yourself. You want to use it as a finishing spell to finish off your opponent. Flame Javelin, which basically for the purpose of this deck is going to be cast for red, 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 and it deals 4 damage to a creature or player. It's just efficient. Flames of the Blood Hand, which deals 4 damage to a player. The damage from Flames of the Blood Hand can be prevented, and if that player would gain life this turn, that player gains no life instead. It's just efficient burn for a player that occasionally will stop some of your opponent's life gain. Incinerate is 3 damage to a creature or player at instant speed, and a creature dealt damage this turn can't be regenerated this turn. Lash Out, which is 3 damage to a creature, and then you clash with an opponent. If you win the clash, you deal 3 damage to that creature's controller. So you're not going to win the clash a lot, but sometimes you will, and then you just got another free Searing Blaze in your deck. Lightning Bolt, the ultimate burn spell, single red for 3 damage to a creature or player. Lightning Strike, 2 mana, 3 damage to a creature or player. Price of Progress, which deals damage to each player equal to 2 times the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So this is extremely powerful against the multicolor decks of the format, and it will win you games basically single-handedly, dealing upwards of 8 to 10 damage for a single card while dealing you 0 or 2, and that's very, very powerful. Searing Blaze, which is for red, red, it deals 1 damage to target creature, 1 damage to target player, and 1 damage to target creature that player controls. But if you had a land enter this turn, you get to deal 3 to that player and 3 to that creature instead. So it's just very, very good removal. And Searing Blood, very similar, 2 damage to target creature, and then when that creature dies this turn, Searing Blood deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. So just insanely good if you're killing a creature with it. This, Searing Blaze, and Lash Out are also all very good if your opponent has a creature that you're killing. Searing Spear, 2 mana, 3 damage to a creature or player. Shard Volley, which has an additional cost of sacking a land, and then it deals 3 damage to a creature or player. This, again, kind of in the same camp as Fire Blast. You don't want to really be playing this defensively, though it's not as bad as Fire Blast. You want to be using this as a sort of finisher card. Skullcrack, which is 2 mana and basically does the same thing as Flames of the Bloodhand. It just does it for the entire turn and to both players. So players can't gain life this turn, damage can't be prevented this turn. Skullcrack deals 3 for 2 mana. Just efficient burn to the player. And then the last instant we have is Violent Eruption, which deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or players, and it has a madness cost of 1 red instead of 1 triple red. You're not really ever going to be madnessing this unless your opponent is forced to discard it, or Ravens crabs you, or Liliana of the Veils, in which case you get a sweet free card out of it. But generally this is just a way to clear out some blockers and deal damage to a player. For sorceries, we'll talk about those next. We have Arc Trail, which deals 2 damage to a creature or player and 1 damage to another target creature or player. Just very good 2-for-1 on small creatures, and later it kind of acts as a mini Searing Blaze, Searing Blood type effect. Chain Lightning, which is basically sorcery speed lightning bolt. It does the same thing as Chain of Plasma, where it can chain back and forth, but it instead of discarding a card for the ability, it costs red. So very rarely is anyone going to be able to chain the lightning back to one of your cards, but it's basically just like having another sorcery speed lightning bolt. Exquisite Firecraft, another 3 damage, deal 4. This one's at sorcery speed, and if you have 2 or more instants and or sorceries in your graveyard, Exquisite Firecraft can't be countered by spells or abilities, so that's just sweet. Fiery Confluence, 4 mana, so it's pretty expensive, kind of like Violent Eruption and the 4 converted mana cost creatures, but it has 3 modes. The mode you'll most often choose is deal 2 damage to each opponent, deal 2 damage to each opponent, deal 2 damage to each opponent. So it's 4 mana, deal 6. Occasionally, you'll be able to destroy some artifacts that are bothering you, and sometimes you'll use it to deal damage to creatures. 1 to clear the way for some tokens that are blocking you, and then deal 4 to player and get in there and really deal some damage. It's just an efficient card, and it at its worst is dealing plenty of damage for its converted mana cost. Firebolt is just the sorcery speed, deal 2 shock effect. It just has flashback for later on in the game. Flame Slash is a 1 red, deal 4 to a creature. Fork Bolt is deal 2 red for deal 2 divided as you choose among 1 or 2 target creatures or players. Just another Arc Trail type card, good early on for clearing the way for creatures, and then later on it can still deal damage to players. Incendiary Flow is a sorcery speed, deal 3 to target creature or player, and if a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. Lava Spike is red for deal 3 to a player. Mizzium Mortars is 1 in red for 4 damage to target creature you don't control. It occasionally, I do mean occasionally, will have its overload of 3 colorless red, which will deal 4 damage to all creatures you don't control. Rift Bolt is 3 mana, deal 3, but generally you'll be suspending it for a single red, and then you'll remove the time counter at your upkeep, and you'll be able to cast it. So it's kind of like another sorcery speed lightning bolt that you have to wait a turn to get. We have Roast, which is 2 mana, deal 5 to a creature without flying, and then Volcanic Hammer, which is sorcery speed, deal 3 to target creature or player. So of these cards, I'm playing a lot of burn that only hits creatures, and my reasoning for that is I want to get a lot of damage out of the creatures that I'm playing, and some of it is a lot of it only goes for creatures. Examples: Lash Out, Searing Blaze, Searing Blood, uh, Flame Slash, Mizzium Mortars, and Roast. But they are very efficient at clearing the way for blockers, and they're very good in the deck. So I know some people will think they won't like that I'm playing a lot of cards that only kill creatures and don't deal damage to players. Their argument will be that you'll draw it and you'll have needed a burn spell that deals damage to a player instead, and it'll feel really bad, but the same can be said for cards that only deal damage to players when you need to kill a creature. So like Skullcrack, Flames of the Bloodhand, Lava Spike, uh, stuff like that are going to feel equally as bad in the opposite situation. So you shouldn't think about that. You should just move on, go with the flow. For non-creature, non-land permanents, we've got 5 Sulfuric Vortex for 1 red red. It's an enchantment that at the beginning of each player's upkeep, it deals 2 damage to that player. So you'll always be ahead on the damage from this because your opponent takes 2, then you take 2, then they take 4 while you've only taken 2. It will even up on your turn, but uh, you're almost always going to be ahead on life. So this will slowly tick down and force the opponent to really react. And the fact that it keeps them from gaining life is a sweet upside. This card is very good and will single-handedly kill control decks if they let it resolve. Kind of like Koth, who for 4 mana is a 3 loyalty planeswalker. His plus is the most used ability, and it untaps target mountain. It becomes a 4/4 red elemental until end of turn. It's still a land. So you get to on 4, pay 4 mana, cast it, plus Koth, get a 4/4 creature and attack with it. Minus is add red to your mana pool for each mountain you control. Doesn't come up very often. I've used it maybe 2 or 3 times. Something I will note is that sometimes you'll be forced to choose between, say, Koth and another 4-drop. Don't forget you can resolve your Koth, minus it to make 4 off of 4 red mana off of 4 mountains, cast your 4-drop, and then you've basically developed a free Koth, which is going to start plussing and putting on a lot of pressure on the next turn. So keep that in mind. On artifacts, we've got Bone Splitter, which costs 1 mana and equips for 1 and gives a equipped creature +2/+0. That's just very efficient. Same can be said about Grafted Wargear, which costs 3 mana. It equips for 0, gives the equipped creature +3/+2. And when Grafted Wargear becomes unattached from a creature, sacrifice that creature. So you can't go moving it around from creature to creature to like play defense or whatever, attack with a creature, have it equipped to that, move it to something else for blocks. You can't do that, but it doesn't really matter that much because you're just going to be buffing up a creature and hitting for a ton of damage. And then we have Tangle Wire, which for 3 mana has Fading 4, which is different from Vanishing in that when you can't remove a time counter from it, you sacrifice it. I guess in this case they're called Fade counters. So it'll be 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 still be in play, then at your next upkeep you'll sacrifice it. So this card's super unsymmetrical. First of all, you can stack the triggers to put the tap trigger on the stack and then the fading trigger. So you'll fade down 1, then you'll tap. First of all, you'll be tapping 1 less because it'll go from 4 to 3. And then you can tap Tangle Wire to itself. So you only have to tap 2 permanents. And it's basically, if you resolve it on turn 3 and your opponent has nothing on board, you're going to be dealing a ton of free damage to them. It's very, very powerful. For the mana base, we're playing 37 lands, 33 of which are mountains. And we have 2 creatures lands, Mishra's Factory, which is technically slightly better because it blocks better, and then Mutavault. They both become 2/2 creatures for a single colorless mana. They're just nice to have additional creatures in the deck and have your lands sometimes do something other than just produce mana. Then we have Teetering Peaks, which when it comes into play, you give target creature +2/+0 until end of turn. So it's essentially like you got a free shock out of it. It's like you played it, tapped it for a red, and got a free shock out of nowhere. So it's just very good. Barbarian Ring, which taps for a red mana and then deals a damage to you. And then if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you can pay a red, sacrifice Barbarian Ring, and deal 2 damage to something. Some other lands that you could play. Reach Sanitarium isn't terrible if you don't own a Mutavault or something. And the fetch lands are good if you're playing Grim Lavamancer. So the general game plan for this deck is to resolve Zurgo turn 1, a 2-drop creature ideally on turn 2, and then deal as much damage as possible with those creatures, and then hopefully finish off the game with burn spells. Sometimes you'll have more creatures in that mix or more burn spells, but generally that's the idea. You look to end games by turn 5. So the deck's very fast in the format, and a lot of decks, if they're not prepared for a bunch of small red fast creatures, they're just gonna lose to it very hard. And the deck is very cheap for you to make. So if you're looking at an entry gate into the format, you don't know if you're gonna like it or not. If you cut Goblin Guide from the deck, which is far and away the most expensive card at $35 on TCG Player, as you can see right here, it says 117. So if you were to cut Goblin Guide from the deck, that puts it down to $82, which is a very reasonable cost for a deck. If you cut the Mutavault, which is 10 more, it goes down to 72, and that's very cheap. So uh, just keep this deck in mind when you're looking to build a deck for the format. The last thing I want to mention is that uh, this deck, if you are already in the format, feels like a very good metagame deck. If your opponents are playing lots of control, not a lot of ground creature decks, this deck will eat up your metagame, especially if they're not prepared for it. So I think the deck's very, very good, and I hope you give it a try. I hope this video helped out.